Sir Walter Scott said, "Oh, what a tangled web we weave, when first we practice to deceive."
In episode 5, we will see that there's no doubt that Patty Rorrer is a perfect DNA match to the hairs tested by the FBI lab. However, there's a big question. Are these the same hairs that were found on Joanne Katranak's car seat?
First of all, Judges for Justice cannot thank our viewers enough. We truly appreciate your interest. In episode 5, you will see that the devil is in the details as we address some of the questions that persist. One question: if the FBI lab sent the 3 Q1 hairs back to the PSP lab on October 13, 1995, then how did they get back to the FBI lab for DNA testing in 1997? Another question: if the Q1, Q7, and Q8 hairs tested by the FBI in 1997 were not the original crime-related hairs, but instead were Patty Rorrer's hairs substituted in, then how did that happen? We hope to shed some light on possible answers to both those questions in episode 5. Let's get an overview of the 8 crime-related hairs. Initially, 6 light in color hairs were found on Joanne Katranak's driver's seat backrest in December 1994. After the victims' bodies were found in April 1995, 2 more long hairs were found. In total, there were 8 long hairs not belonging to Joanne Katranak that played a part in this case. This chart gives an outline of where the 8 hairs were found and how they were designated. Of the 6 hairs found on the victim's driver's seatback, 3 were mounted on slides and became the Q4, Q5, and Q6 hairs. 3 were loose, unmounted, and became known collectively as the Q1 hairs. The hair found on the diaper bag became known as the Q7 hair. The hair found in the forest litter became known as the Q8 hair. If you have watched the first 4 episodes, you are aware of this timeline. To fully understand episode 5, please embed this timeline in your memory. Joanne and Alex Katranak disappeared on December 15, 1994, or 12/15/94. On 4/9/95, their bodies were found in a patch of woods about 14 miles from their home. On 4/18/95, the Pennsylvania State Police, the PSP, submitted biological samples of the victims to the FBI lab for DNA testing. These are the K1 through K5 samples. On 7/12/95, the PSP submitted 3 hairs with blood on them to the FBI lab for DNA testing. They wanted to see if the blood matches the victims. These are the 3 Q1 hairs. On 10/13/95, the FBI returns the Q1 hairs and the K1 through K5 samples to the PSP. On 11/16/95, the PSP submits a form that references the Q1 hairs and K1 through K5 samples as still being with the FBI lab. If the FBI lab returned the evidence on 10/13/95, then how could the evidence have gotten back into the FBI's possession on 11/16/95? It is important to understand what happened between the 10/13/95 and 11/16/95 dates. In Episode 5, we will show you that on 11/10/95, the PSP lab was in possession of all 8 of the crime-related hairs and also in possession of at least 50 of Patty Rorrer's hairs. We will see a report that shows PSP troopers visiting the FBI lab on 11/15/95, the day before 11/16/95. Plus, the troopers had in their possession some of Patty Rorrer's hairs to compare with the Q1 hairs. This is a police photo of Joanne Katranak's abandoned 1992 tan Toyota Corolla. Her car was found about 2:45 a.m. on December 16, 1994. The car was about 150 yards from the Katranak residence, 740 Front Street in Catasauqua, PA. Joanne's car was taken into Pennsylvania State Police custody as evidence. From December 19th to December 21st, 1994, the car was gone over by crime scene investigator PSP Trooper Koya. This is a police photo of the inside of Joanne's car. Trooper Koya located a clump of 6 hairs on the backrest of the driver's seat. The trooper collected the hairs and put them into evidence. The 6 seatback hairs were submitted to the Pennsylvania State Police Laboratory. PSP lab scientist Mr. Thomas Jensen examined the hairs. He mounted 3 of the hairs onto slides. 3 of the hairs remained loose, that is, unmounted. The 3 unmounted hairs will become known as the Q1 hairs. This is a magnified view of the split end of one of the 3 unmounted hairs. It appears to have dried blood on it. These are Mr. Jensen's lab notes from 23 June 95. The handwriting in the red box says, quote, "Stereo microscopic exam of 3 unmounted light hairs of item 3E showed some apparent blood stain on the side of same hair, and one of the hairs has a very frayed end with apparent blood particles lodged within the frayed end." End quote. The first sentence of the 23 June 95 entry says, "Measured max, min diameter of hairs on slides 1, 2, and 3. These 3 hairs will become the Q4, Q5, and Q6 hairs." This is a July 12, 1995 FBI evidence receipt form. We see the FBI laboratory number in the upper right, 507120022. The description of the evidence submitted is in the lower left. It states, quote, "3 unmounted hairs found in victim's vehicle. Hairs appear to have blood on them." End quote. These are the Q1 hairs. The viewer will see this 7/12/95 FBI submittal document a few times in Episode 5. Of particular note is that the PSP makes no mention of there being a hair root on the 3 hairs from which a nuclear DNA profile could be obtained. Let's learn a little about human hairs and DNA. A hair can give us mitochondrial DNA from the hair shaft, and if a hair is actively growing and the hair forcibly removed, the root can yield nuclear DNA. Nuclear DNA is present in the nucleus of a cell and is inherited from both parents. Mitochondrial DNA is present in small structures outside of the nucleus of a cell. Mitochondria supply energy to the cell. This form of DNA is inherited maternally from the mother. This is page 1 of a 3-page May 30th, 1997 report from Dr. Joseph A. DeZeno of the FBI lab. Dr. DeZeno is sending this report to Mr. Thomas Jensen of the Pennsylvania State Police Crime Laboratory. This is page 2 of Dr. DeZeno's May 30th, 1997 report. He notes, quote, "A mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA sequence was obtained for the Q1 hair from the seatback, FBI laboratory number 50712-022S," end quote. The hair found on the baby's diaper bag has been designated as the Q7 hair. The hair from the litter and soil has been designated the Q8 hair. Dr. DeZeno notes that the K6 specimen is a bloodstain from Patricia Lynn Rorrer. The last two sentences of the bottom paragraph state, quote, "The mtDNA sequences obtained from specimens Q1, Q7, Q8, and K6 are the same. Therefore, Patricia Lynn Rorrer cannot be excluded as the source of the Q1, Q7, and Q8 hairs," end quote. A reasonable person could conclude that Patty Rorrer is the killer of Joanne and Alex Katranak. However, there are indications that these Q1, Q7, and Q8 hairs tested by Dr. DeZeno in 1997 are not authentic, not original crime scene hairs. Dr. DeZeno's notes support the concerns. These are Dr. DeZeno's handwritten notes relating to his mtDNA testing of the Q1 hair and other evidence. In his microscopic examination, Dr. DeZeno noted that the Q1 hair was, quote, "not art-RX'd," end quote. In the subject line to this email from Dr. DeZeno, you can see he's being asked, what does it mean when he writes art-RX or not art-RX? DeZeno responds, "I assume that art-RX was written in my notes and it would refer to artificial treatment." We think it is fair to say that the Q1 hair that Dr. DeZeno examined for mtDNA was not artificially treated. This is a photo of Patty Rorrer on December 5, 1994, 10 days before Joanne and Alex Katranak disappeared. She is in Oklahoma at a national penning contest. She and her teammates won their division. 10 days before the Katranaks disappeared on 12/15/94, Patty had artificially treated hair in two different ways. Her hair was bleached and it was permed. Because Dr. DeZeno observed that the Q1 hair was not artificially treated, it was not bleached or permed, we believe that the Q1 hair that Dr. DeZeno examined was not a Patty Rorrer hair from December 1994. Nor do we believe that the Q1 hair Dr. DeZeno examined was a hair taken from the seatback of Joanne Katranak's car. This is part of the trial transcript. Prosecutor Mike McIntyre is asking Mr. Thomas Jensen, PSP Lab Criminalist, about one of the Q1 hairs. He asks, "Was there any color change?" Mr. Jensen responded, quote, "Yes, it progressed from being brown at the root end, the proximal end, out to really almost colorless at the tip." End quote. Mr. Jensen went on to say that the Q1 hair, in his opinion, has been subjected to some bleaching action of some sort as it was growing out. This is circumstantial evidence. Based on our common sense and experience, we can infer that Dr. DeZinno was not looking at a hair that was artificially treated. Therefore, it was probably not an original Q1 hair taken from the victim's driver seat back, nor was it a hair from Patty Rorrer's head in December 1994. In 2019, investigator Ira Todd, a former homicide detective, traveled to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania to interview Thomas Jensen for the Starz Network show Wrong Man. Jensen agreed to be interviewed, but wouldn't go on camera.
She apparently stopped bleaching her hair right after being interviewed by the investigators and realizing that they were interested in her hair. You start down near the root and you're looking at normal brownish hair, okay? And all of a sudden, you've got bleached. You could see the sharp line. You're following along the brown trail, and oh, there's colorless hair.
Okay.
In this 2019 interview, Mr. Jensen seems to have a good memory of what the hairs look like under the microscope. He said that at the root it was normal brown hair. You start down the hair, and all of a sudden there's a sharp line where the hair turns colorless. Jensen's description of a colorless hair tip also matches this photo of a Q1 hair. We believe it is fair to say that Jensen's description is more evidence that the Q1 hair Dr. DeZinno observed was not an original hair from the seat back of Joanne Katrinek's car. And if this Q1 hair was not an original crime-related hair, then it calls into question the other 7 crime-related hairs. This is page 1 of the September 16, 1997 FBI lab report of Dr. Harold A. Dedman. He notes that there is a root on one of the Q1 hairs, and he subjected it to DNA analysis. He notes it was not the same Q1 hair on which mitochondrial DNA testing was conducted. This is the 1998 trial transcript where Dr. Dedman is testifying about how the 3 Q1 hairs had been returned to him after Dr. DeZinno had done his mtDNA analysis. Upon examining the hairs, he determined that one of the hairs had a root that was consistent with being a forcibly removed hair, a hair that had been forcibly pulled from a person's scalp. This is page 2 of the September 16, 1997 Dr. Dedman's FBI lab report. The K6 specimen is a blood sample from Patty Rorrer. Dr. Dedman concludes that Patty Rorrer is a potential contributor of the Q1 hair root he tested. This is bad news for Patty Rorrer. In addition to her hairs being a mitochondrial DNA match to the Q1, Q7, and Q8 hairs, one of the other Q1 hairs is a nuclear DNA match. However, there are problems with this finding of a hair root. That being, in 1995, an FBI special agent reported that the 3Q1 hairs had, quote, no roots attached, end quote. This is page 3 of a November 30th, 1995 report written by FBI Special Agent Dave Rowe. Special Agent Rowe was the Allentown resident agent for the FBI in the 1990s. Paragraph 10A states, quote, found in car on driver's headrest, 3 hairs 9 inches long, no roots attached, and blood on 2 of the 3. PSP lab reported hair not that of victims, presently at FBI lab for DNA analysis, end quote. Special Agent Rowe is an experienced FBI agent. He has a law degree. He is trained to be accurate. He is knowledgeable about the case. He would not make the statement that there were no roots attached unless that information came from a trusted and knowledgeable source. This is page 1 of a memo concerning a May 3, 2022 phone call between FBI resident agent Dave Rowe, now retired, and myself, Mike Heavey. This is page 2 of the memo. At the bottom, it reflects that I wrote the original memo on May 3, 2022. It was modified on May 5 and May 6, 2022, after input from Dave Rowe. Retired Special Agent Rowe told me he was the author of the No Roots Attached memo. Rowe informed me that in 1995, he spoke with troopers Joe Kosovar and Bob Egan almost on a daily basis. Kosovar and Egan were the lead investigators on the Katrinac murder case. Dave Rowe told me that at the time, late 1994 to 1996, he and other investigators were learning about DNA. It was still fairly new. They had learned of the importance of having a root on a hair from the PSP lab. Rowe says he had learned, probably via Kosovar and Egan, hair could only be tested for DNA if it had a root attached. Dave Rowe told me at the time he wrote the 11/30/95 memo, it was his understanding that the PSP lab had determined that there were no roots attached to crime scene hairs. They, the police officers and PSP lab, believed early on in the investigation that the crime scene hairs were of no use for getting DNA because of the lack of a root. In 1997, an FBI scientist observed a root on one of the 3 Q1 hairs. The root was DNA tested and was a match to Patty Rorrer. FBI resident agent Dave Rowe's report that there were no roots attached is circumstantial evidence. Based upon our common sense and experience, we can infer that the 1997 Q1 hair with a root was not authentic. That is, it was not an original Q1 hair. This is an article about the 3 stages of hair growth. Notice the importance of a hair being, quote, forcibly removed, end quote. The first stage is the anagen stage, in which the hair is actively growing. Hairs forcibly removed during this stage will have follicular tissue adhering to it. The second stage is the catagen stage. In this stage, a hair can be easily dislodged. The third stage is the telogen stage, when the hair is naturally shed. This is an abstract from the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. Hair roots in the actively growing anagen phase are an excellent source of nuclear DNA, while hair roots in the resting telogen stage lack sufficient nuclear DNA. In 1995, Dr. Dedman of the FBI lab examined the 3 Q1 hairs. He did not mention seeing a Q1 hair that had been forcibly removed, that is, in the anagen stage. This would change in 1997. In his trial testimony, Dr. Dedman of the FBI noted that upon examining the Q1 hairs, one of the hairs had a root which was consistent with being a forcibly removed hair. On November 8, 1995, Patty Rorrer's hairs were forcibly removed. That is, 3 clumps of her hair were yanked out. In this page from the trial transcript, Mike McIntyre is on cross with Patty Rorrer. She says the doctor grabbed a handful of her hair at a time and yanked. She confirms that the hairs were not taken out separately, but 3 times the doctor grabbed a clump of her hair and then pulled them out. Patty Rorrer's hairs were forcibly removed. This is consistent with Dr. Dedman's description of one of the Q1 hairs. Judges for Justice believes the Q1 hair examined by Dr. Dedman in 1997 may not have been an original Q1 hair because it had a forcibly removed hair root and it was in the first stage of growth, the anagen phase. Instead, this is consistent with and may have been a forcibly removed hair from Patty Rorrer's scalp. In total, Dr. Dedman in 1997 saw 5 of the 8 crime-related hairs to have forcibly removed hair roots. These are Dedman's bench notes from 5/30/97. He reviewed the photos Dr. DeZino took of the Q7 and Q8 hairs. He notes the hairs may have been forcibly removed, that is, possible anagen hairs. This is suspicious. What are the chances of random hairs on the diaper bag and in the forest litter to have been forcibly removed? At the bottom of the page, Dr. Dedman notes that hairs mounted on slides, the Q4 and possibly the Q6, have a, quote, stretched root, end quote. We are informed this is another way of saying the hairs were forcibly removed. So, in 1995, neither Thomas Jensen of the PSP lab nor Dr. Dedman saw any of the crime-related hairs to have been forcibly removed. In 1997, however, Dr. Dedman observes 5 of the 8 to have been forcibly removed. This is concerning. In July 2021, I traveled to Allentown and met with prosecutor Michael McIntyre at his home for about 3 hours. He was cordial and at times reflective. Like this segment from NBC's Murder in Lehigh Valley, Keith Morrison Investigates, where McIntyre tells Keith Morrison he can't completely rule out the possibility that a hair switch may have been done by a mole in the state police crime lab.
That's on 1,000,000% sure of.
Categorically reject any possibility.
Of government switch, of my switching? Well, my switching categorically reject, but is it possible we had some kind of mole in the state police crime lab? You know, it's so ridiculous, but yet I can't rule it completely out.
This is a page from the trial transcript of Patty Rorrer. Prosecutor McIntyre is examining her. McIntyre is pointing out that the PSP investigators came to North Carolina on November 8, 1995, with a search warrant for her hair and blood. This is the next page of the trial transcript. McIntyre asks how many places the doctor took hairs from her head. Patty Rorrer responds, "He pulled 3 times." And Mike McIntyre responds, "All right, but he got 39 hairs. Do you know that?" When I visited Mike McIntyre at his home in July 2021, at one point I asked him why he had asked Patty Rorrer if she knew the doctor had pulled 39 hairs from her head. He said he couldn't remember. I followed up by saying that his statement indicated he counted the Patty Rorrer hairs that he was aware of, and there were 39 of them. He again said he couldn't remember. This is another page from the trial transcript. One of Rorer's attorneys, Jim Pfeiffer, is examining Lieutenant Tony Roberson of the Davidson County, North Carolina Sheriff's Office. Lieutenant Roberson was present in the room when Dr. Blackerby took the hairs from Patty Rorer's head on November 8, 1995. Pfeiffer asks in line 10, "Do you know how many hairs he took?" Roberson responded, quote, "He made the statement to me that he knew he had to take at least 50 hairs." End quote. Let's assume that Mr. McIntyre, prior to Patty Rorer's trial, counted the number of Rorrer hairs he was aware of, and that number was 39. If Dr. Blackerby extracted at least 50 hairs from Patty Rorer's scalp, then there appears to be at least 11 of her hairs missing. What happened to them? Did some of Patty's missing hairs become the 8 crime-related hairs? This is page 1 of a 2-page FBI lab report dated October 13, 1995. The FBI lab is reporting back to the Pennsylvania State Police Lab. It notes that evidence was received on April 18, 1995 and on July 12, 1995. The FBI lab reports that they received specimens on April 18, 1995. K stands for known. K1 through K4 were spleen and vertebrae samples from Joanne and Alex Katranak. The known K5 sample was blood from Andrew Katranak. The FBI further reports they received specimens on July 12, 1995. Q stands for questioned. The questioned specimens were the Q1 hairs from seatback. In Episode 2, we learned that the FBI lab determined that the blood on the Q1 hairs could belong to Joanne Katranak, but they weren't sure because there was a mixture. Eventually, it turned out that the blood on the Q1 hairs belonged to Joanne Katranak. And eventually, Mr. Tom Jensen of the PSP lab would be identified as the other donor to the mixture. He had contaminated the Q1 hairs by spreading them out with his bare fingers. The first sentence in the bottom paragraph says, quote, "The submitted items and the probed membranes are being returned to your office under separate cover by registered mail." End quote. The submitted items are the 3 Q1 hairs. The probed membranes are the K1 through K5 biological samples. The entire Commonwealth case against Patty Rorrer is predicated upon the belief that the FBI lab was wrong. They actually did not return the Q1 hairs and the K1 through K5 samples as they stated. Instead, the FBI kept the evidence. This is an undated letter from Trooper Robert V. Egan III to Dr. Harold A. Dedman of the DNA section at the FBI lab. In the lower left, it is noted that the letter was postmarked 1/26/96 and received on 1/29/96. Egan starts by saying that he has made 3 submissions to the FBI laboratory regarding DNA analysis. Egan states that on 4/18/95 he submitted spleen and vertebrae samples from Joanne and Alex Katranak and a blood sample from Andrew Katranak, the K1 through K5 samples. PSP Trooper Egan states that on 7/12/95 he submitted 3 hairs from the victim's vehicle seatback. These are the Q1 hairs. Trooper Egan is acting like the FBI lab never returned the Q1 hairs and K1 through K5 samples under separate cover by registered mail on October 13, 1995. Judges for Justice believes the lab did not make a mistake. They actually returned to the PSP the Q1 hairs and the K1 through K5 samples on October 13, 1995. In addition to the evidence being returned, the K1 through K5 samples and the Q1 hairs, the FBI is sending back a third item, the remaining processed DNA examined by DNA analysis. The FBI lab notes that the third item being returned, the processed DNA, can be found in a package marked "Processed DNA samples should be refrigerated, frozen," and the FBI lab recommended that these samples be stored in a refrigerator freezer and isolated from evidence that has not been examined. This is a Pennsylvania State Police property record for 1998. Please note the 5th line down, which says, DNA evidence from FBI lab number 507120222S. We believe this is the processed DNA from the testing of the blood on the Q1 hairs. In this post-trial March 1998 inventory of evidence in the possession of the PSP, we see that in line 3 are the K1 through K5 biological samples stored in the fridge. We also see that in line 7 are the 3 Q1 hairs. This is a note evidencing that PSP Trooper Egan picked up certain pieces of evidence from the FBI lab on December 5, 1997. We see that he picked up the K1 through K5 samples and the Q1, Q2, and Q3 hairs, the 3 Q1 hairs. There is no mention that he picked up the processed DNA from the 1995 testing of the blood on the Q1 hairs. This is page 2 of the FBI's 10/13/95 report. They note they are returning the processed DNA to the PSP lab under separate cover. It is faint, but notice that the line 5 DNA evidence from FBI lab appears to be stored in the fridge, pursuant to the FBI lab directions. We believe this is the processed DNA that the FBI lab report said was being returned under separate cover on October 13, 1995, now in possession of the PSP. This is proof, in our opinion, that the processed DNA from the testing of the blood on the Q1 hairs was, in fact, returned to the PSP. It was returned by the FBI on October 13, 1995, and probably received by the PSP shortly thereafter. We think it is likely that in addition to returning the processed DNA, the FBI also returned the Q1 hairs and the K1 through K5 samples. It is unlikely the FBI lab only returned just the processed DNA and not the Q1 hairs and K1 through K5 samples too. So, if the FBI lab returned the K1 through K5 samples and the Q1 hairs on October 13, 1995, then how did both of them get back into the possession of the FBI lab on January 26, 1996? This letter from Egan also noted that on 11/16/95, he submitted the victim's brown leather jacket and a blood sample from Patty Rorrer. He definitely did. Here's an FBI evidence receipt form dated 11/16/95. The evidence was delivered by Trooper Robert V. Egan III. Item number 1 is the brown leather jacket that was on Joanne Katranak's lifeless body when she was found. Item number 2 was 2 patches of human blood. In the lower right, Trooper Egan is asking the FBI lab to do, quote, DNA analysis of blood on leather jacket and blood on patches and compare to the previous submitted items lab number 5041804 5 SQF dated 4/18/95 and lab number 50712-022 SQF dated 7/12/95. End quote. In filling out this November 16, 1995 evidence form, Egan is establishing inferentially that the K1 through K5 samples submitted on 4/18/95 are still with the FBI, and he is establishing that the 3 Q1 hairs submitted on 7/12/95 are also still with the FBI. Judges for Justice believes that Trooper Egan's drive down to the D.C. lab on 11/16/95 to submit the victim's leather jacket was mere pretext for a more nefarious reason. His true purpose was to make reference to the K1 through K5 samples and the Q1 hairs as still being in the possession of the FBI lab. Egan was laying a foundation that the FBI lab had not returned the evidence on October 13, 1995. We believe this is the smoking gun of how the Q1 hairs may have got back into the possession of the FBI. This is a November 30, 1995 FBI memo addressed to the SAC, the special agent in charge of the Philadelphia FBI office. His name has been redacted, but the memorandum was written by the FBI Allentown resident agent, Special Agent Dave Rowe. In a May 2022 telephone conversation, Dave Rowe told me that during 1995, he talked to troopers Joe Kosovar and Bob Egan on almost a daily basis. Special Agent Rowe is reporting the status of the Katranak murder investigation to his supervisor in Philadelphia. He notes that the PSP investigation has focused upon Patricia Lynn Rorrer. Rowe notes that during mid-November 1995, PSP troopers Bob Egan and Joseph Kosovar, Troop M, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, traveled to North Carolina, secured a local search warrant, and thereafter obtained from Rorrer a blood sample, hair sample, and fingerprints. Notice that Special Agent Rowe is unsure of the date, so he describes it in general terms as mid-November. The actual date was November 8, 1995. Dave Rowe reports that the blood and hair exemplars secured from Rorrer were delivered to the FBI laboratory, Washington, D.C., by troopers Egan and Kosovar on 11/15/95. Although FBI agent Rowe was unsure as to the exact date that the blood and hair samples of Patty Rorrer were taken, he appears to be sure that Egan and Kosovar went to the FBI lab on 11/15/95, a Wednesday. This would have been the day before Egan took the victim's brown leather jacket to the FBI lab, on Thursday, November 16, 1995. Special Agent Rowe further reports, quote, more particularly, same were delivered to the DNA section for the following comparisons, end quote. He's saying that Patty Rorrer's blood and hair samples were delivered to the DNA section of the FBI lab on 11/15/95. We think it is significant that Rowe is saying the DNA section. One inference is the PSP troopers may have gone straight to the DNA section, bypassing the normal evidence submittal procedures. Rowe goes on to say, quote, comparison, both visual and DNA, of Rorrer hair exemplars with several hairs found in victim's automobile, end quote. We believe it is fair to say, if the FBI lab had returned the Q1 hairs on October 13th, and Egan and Kosovar wanted the FBI lab to compare the Rorrer hair samples with the car seat hairs, then the troopers would have had to bring the Q1 hairs with them. It is significant that Special Agent Rowe makes no mention of taking a brown leather jacket to the DNA section. We believe this rules out a mix-up of the dates. Just as we think it is significant that Egan doesn't mention here, on 11/16/95, his visit to the DNA section the day before, on 11/15/95. If the FBI lab actually returned the Q1 hairs to the PSP on October 13, 1995, then we believe they may have been reinserted back into the possession of the FBI on 11/15/95. Did Trooper Egan return the Q1 hairs to the FBI on 11/15/95? We believe it's possible, maybe even probable, but we don't know for sure. We weren't there. Veterans Day is a federal holiday in the United States, observed annually on November 11th. It is a day set aside to honor military veterans of the United States Armed Forces. This is page 48 of PSP criminalist Mr. Thomas E. Jensen's records. This page contains Mr. Jensen's lab notes from 10 November 95 through 4 December 95. November 11th was a Saturday in 1995, and the Friday before, November 10, was a day off for most Americans, a 3-day weekend. We see that blood and hair reference samples from Patricia Rorrer were delivered to the Pennsylvania State Police Crime Lab by troopers Kosovar and Egan on 10 November 95. Tom Jensen notes that in the middle of the 3-day weekend, on Saturday, 11 November 95, he stopped into the lab and sealed an envelope with DNA-patched blood. On November 21, 11 days after they were delivered, Jensen opens the manila envelope and notes that the color of Patty Rorrer's hairs were, quote, visually medium brown, end quote. Over the years, the description of the color of the Q1 hairs has varied. At Patty Rorrer's trial, Thomas Jensen, the PSP lab criminalist, testified that one of the Q1 hairs was brown at the root end, out to colorless at the tip, and he said it was his opinion that the hair had been subject to some bleaching action. At the 1998 trial, Jensen testified that this is the only photo he took of any of the 6 car seat hairs, one of the Q1 hairs with blood on it. This hair appears to be colorless at the tip, consistent with his trial testimony. In his 23 June 95 lab notes, Thomas Jensen describes the color of the Q1 hairs to be light. That is, quote, 3 unmounted light hairs, end quote. Jensen's observations that the hairs were light in color are consistent with the crime scene investigator who found the hairs. PSP Trooper Koya was a crime scene investigator for the Pennsylvania State Police. He collected evidence from Joanne Katranak's car from December 19th through December 21st, 1994. Trooper Koya testified that while he was processing the victim's car, he was able to locate a little group of hairs that were similar in color, like a dirty blonde or blondish hair, that were on the backrest of the seat. This group of hairs would number 6 in total and become the 3 Q1 hairs and the Q4, Q5, and Q6 hairs. We think it is fair to say the 6 hairs were blonde, light in color. On July 12, 1995, the PSP submitted 3 unmounted hairs, the Q1 hairs, to the FBI lab. It appeared there was blood on the hairs, and the PSP wanted the blood DNA tested. These are the typed up bench notes of FBI lab scientist Dr. Harold A. Dedman. On August 28, 1995, Dr. Dedman identifies the Q1 hairs as, quote, several blonde appearing hairs, end quote. Both Dr. Dedman and Trooper Koya described the color of the hairs as blonde. Also consistent with Dr. Dedman's blonde color observation was Mr. Jensen saying the hairs were light in color, colorless at the tip in June of 1995. However, we're going to see that in 1997, Dr. Dedman will describe the color of the Q1 hairs as brown. These are the handwritten bench notes of FBI scientist Dr. Harold A. Dedman. In the lower right-hand corner, you can see the first 2 letters of his initials, H.A. The D was cut off in the copying process. We believe these are Dr. Dedman's bench notes from June or July of 1997. Dr. Dedman had the 3 Q1 hairs delivered to him after Dr. DeZeno did his mitochondrial DNA testing. You can see the reference to mito testing. Dr. DeZeno issued his mtDNA report on May 30, 1997. We think it is rather concerning that Dr. Dedman, who had described the hairs as blonde in 1995, describes 2 of the 3 Q1 hairs as brown in 1997. Maybe on Saturday, November 11, 1995, Mr. Thomas Jensen did more than he describes in his notes. It raises a question. Did the 8 crime-related hairs go from blonde to brown on Veterans Day, 1995? When you first look at this case, it is hard to believe that the PSP would have reinserted the Q1 hairs and the K1 through K5 samples back into FBI possession on 11/15/95, but easier to believe if you consider a few things. It is easier to believe they were reinserted if you consider that the evidence shows the FBI lab returned the Q1 hairs and the K1 through K5 samples to the PSP lab on 10/13/95. There is no other explanation for how they got back into the FBI's possession. It is easier to believe the evidence was reintroduced on 11/15/95 if you consider the visit was to the DNA section of the FBI lab, possibly bypassing normal evidence intake procedures. The troopers, according to this report, had in their possession the Rorrer hair exemplars to compare with several hairs found in victim's automobile. When you first go over this case, the second thing that is hard to believe is that the hairs tested by the FBI lab in 1997 were not authentic. That is, they were not the original crime-related hairs. In 1997, Dr. Dedman saw a Q1 hair with a forcibly removed hair root. It is easier to believe the hair Dedman saw in 1997 was not authentic if you consider FBI Special Agent Dave Rowe's 1995 report that the 3 Q1 hairs had no roots attached. If the Q1 hair observed by Dr. Dedman was not authentic, it calls into question the other 7 crime-related hairs. And it's easier to believe hairs tested in 1997 were not authentic if you consider that Rowe's information came from the PSP lab via the PSP troopers. Also, it's easier to believe the 1997 hairs were not authentic if you consider the Q1 hair Dr. DeZino saw was not artificially treated. It's easier to conclude that Dr. DeZino was not looking at an original Q1 hair because Jensen has consistently reported that the Q1 hairs were bleached, brown at the root end, colorless at the tip. And when you first look at this case, perhaps the hardest thing to believe is that the PSP lab may have substituted Patty Rorrer's hairs for the crime-related hairs. However, it's easier to believe a hair switch may have happened if you consider that the key evidence in the case, the Q1 hairs, were contaminated by Thomas Jensen of the PSP lab. Jensen's DNA was in the mixture because he spread out a Q1 hair with his bare hands. Such a mistake calls into question his very being as a scientist. Most likely, Jensen was ashamed of his mistake. Besides being embarrassed, he was probably mortified that his contamination may have screwed up the entire case. Did Jensen seek redemption? Did he engage in noble cause corruption? It becomes easier to believe there was corruption if we accept as true that on 10/13/95, the FBI lab returned the Q1 hairs and the K1 through K5 victim samples to the PSP lab. That means in mid-October of 1995, the PSP lab was in possession of all 8 of the crime-related hairs, 3 Q1 hairs and 5 other hairs, Q4 through Q8. That means on Veterans Day, Saturday, November 11th, 1995, Mr. Thomas E. Jensen had the means, motive, and opportunity to make the hair switch. Here, Jensen is talking in 2019 about a Q1 hair.
You're looking at a normal brownish hair, okay? And all of a sudden, you've got bleached. You could see the sharp line. You're following along the brown trail, and oh, there's colorless hair.
Mr. Jensen had contaminated the Q1 hairs by spreading them out with his bare hands. Coupled with his tunnel vision, maybe he saw a chance for redemption. Maybe he was the mole in the PSP crime lab.
Of government switch, of my switching? Well, my switching categorically reject, but is it possible we had some kind of mole in the state police crime lab? It's so ridiculous, but yet I can't rule it completely out.
We can't rule it out either. In fact, based upon all of the evidence, to us, it looks as if the hair evidence may have been switched.